Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back into the half-lit streets of the Middle Ages, where shadows weren't just tricks of candlelight. They were people. Hungry people. Desperate people. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in something warm. Because tonight's story isn't about knights or nobles or glory. It's about the ones who lived around those people. The forgotten. The quiet. The one's history only mentioned when someone ended up dead. These were the ghosts of medieval society. Assassins, thieves, informants, and every shade in between. Not quite heroes, not quite villains. Just the people kings hired when they didn't want to get their hands dirty. Superstition called them demons. The church called them heretics. And kings? Kings called them necessary. Let's take a slow walk into those dark corners where loyalty was for sale, survival was an art form, and morality was a luxury no one could afford. The medieval world was a place of contradictions. On one hand, you had soaring cathedrals and golden altars. On the other, open sewers and famine. Everyone talked about divine order, that God had placed every soul exactly where it belonged, but the people at the bottom, they weren't so sure, especially when they hadn't eaten in 2 days. The peasants worked the fields, the lords took the taxes, and the in-between class, those who didn't fit anywhere, turned to something else entirely. Some became mercenaries, others became thieves, and a select few learned the fine art of killing quietly. They weren't trained assassins in the way we picture today. No cloaks, no secret organizations, well, mostly. These were people with no guild, no master, just hunger and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. If someone needed a rival gone, a secret delivered, or a noble discouraged from marrying the wrong person, there was always someone willing to do it, for a price. Payment came in silver, or silence. Let's float over to one of the first known networks of hired killers, the legendary Hashashin of the 11th century. Now, the word assassin actually comes from them, though like most things in history, it got wildly exaggerated by everyone who wrote about it later. They were based in Persia and Syria, followers of a sect called the Nizari Ismailis. They had their own mountain strongholds, the most famous being Alamut, which sounds dramatic because, well, it was. Their enemies said they were drugged zealots who killed while hallucinating paradise. Their supporters said they were disciplined soldiers fighting a holy war. The truth was somewhere in the middle, as it usually is. Their leader, Hassan-i-Sabah, didn't rule with swords. He ruled with fear. And honestly, it worked. Kings trembled at rumors that an assassin had infiltrated their court. Generals slept with guards at their doors and daggers under their pillows. The brilliance of the Hashashin wasn't just in killing, it was in being seen killing. He made sure every target was public, symbolic, and terrifying. He didn't need an army, just reputation. And that's how you run a medieval marketing campaign. But before you picture these men as silent, noble warriors with secret blades, remember, life in those times was less ninja aesthetic and more please don't starve to death. Most who picked up a blade weren't idealists, they were survivors. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, assassins didn't have sects or secret codes. They had desperation. Take 12th century England, for example. While kings were fighting for divine right, ordinary men were fighting rats for food. The line between outlaw and soldier blurred completely. If a nobleman wanted someone removed discreetly, a rival, a lover, or sometimes a troublesome priest, there was always some disgraced knight or landless squire willing to handle it. And let's be honest, if you were poor, invisible, and already halfway damned by the church, killing one more person seemed like not much of a sin.
One of the most famous medieval hits wasn't done by an assassin at all, but it might as well have been. In 1170, King Henry II of England made the mistake of saying something a little too loud about his former friend, Thomas Becket, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" he shouted, not realizing that 4 knights would take him literally. They rode to Canterbury, stormed the cathedral, and hacked Becket to death on the altar. No payment, no plan, no real motive other than royal loyalty and poor communication. But it sent a message. Words could kill as easily as daggers. The event shocked Europe, but it also showed something new. The idea of political assassination wasn't reserved for shadowy figures anymore. Anyone with ambition, anger, or access could play the game. Meanwhile, over in Italy, because of course it's always Italy, the concept of assassination was about to become an art form. The Italian city-states were rich, proud, and perpetually at war. Florence, Venice, Milan, all beautiful on the outside, but crawling with conspiracies underneath. You couldn't throw a loaf of bread without hitting someone plotting to overthrow someone else, and half the time, the loaf was poisoned anyway. Families like the Visconti, the Sforza, and later the Medici learned the daggers in the dark were cheaper than armies. One carefully placed blade at a banquet could change the entire balance of power, and you wouldn't even have to pay for armor. For the working-class hitmen who carried out these jobs, it was dangerous, dirty work. If you succeeded, you vanished. If you failed, you were executed. And if you were lucky, they'd do it quickly. The church, of course, condemned all of this. Well, officially. Unofficially, popes and bishops were not above hiring problem solvers when diplomacy failed. Medieval papal politics were brutal, especially when your enemies were also technically doing God's work. Some popes employed mercenaries to handle rival clerics, others used poisoners. The Vatican became less of a holy refuge and more of a diplomatic chessboard with occasional fatal accidents. Because nothing says forgiveness and grace like quietly funding an assassination to preserve your political influence. But let's not get too moral about it. These assassins weren't evil masterminds. They were cogs in a system where life was cheap and loyalty cheaper. Imagine a man in 13th century France. He's ex-military, maybe lost a hand in some pointless war, and now survives by drinking, gambling, and occasionally escorting rich merchants through bandit territory. One night, someone buys him a drink. Says he can make a few silver coins doing a simple favor. No names, no details, just a coin purse and an address. And the next morning, someone important wakes up dead, and he's already halfway to another city. That was the medieval assassin's reality. No glory, no brotherhood, just jobs, hunger, and a constant hope that this one wouldn't end with a rope around your neck. Yet somehow, these figures became legends. Because the further we move from reality, the more romantic it all sounds. Chroniclers wrote about mysterious killers vanishing into the fog. Minstrels turned them into dark heroes. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the assassin wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of rebellion, stealth, and secret knowledge. People whispered their names with fear and fascination. The poor called them monsters, the rich called them tools, and history, as usual, forgot their faces entirely. So tonight, as we drift through these cobblestone alleys of the past, Remember, these weren't chosen warriors. They were survivors of a cruel world. They moved like ghosts through taverns and alleyways, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Feared not for their skill, but for their hunger. Let's keep the lantern low and the pace slow, because in part 2, we're going deeper, into the courts, the palaces, and the thrones, where even kings slept with one eye open, and loyalty could be bought with the price of a dagger.
Hey again, still awake or halfway there? Perfect, because tonight we're slipping deeper into the candlelit corridors of medieval power, the kind where whispers were deadlier than swords and nobody trusted anyone, not even their own reflection. If part 1 was about assassins born from hunger, part 2 was about assassins born from politics. You know, the kind of people who could smile through a dinner conversation while quietly deciding if the soup needed a little extra arsenic. Let's float into the royal courts of Europe, where everyone was plotting something and peace was just the time between one convenient death and the next. Picture a palace in the 14th century, marble floors, gold everywhere, servants gliding silently, carrying wine, letters, and secrets. And in the middle of it all, a king who's absolutely terrified of his own family. Welcome to the wonderful world of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, a man who lived up to his name in all the worst ways. Charles was rich, powerful, and obsessed with glory. He also had this charming habit of declaring war on absolutely everyone: France, Switzerland, even his own allies, because apparently being sensible was for peasants. But wars are expensive, and when you're constantly losing them, people start thinking about better options. Rumors spread that a few nobles might have been plotting against him, and honestly, who could blame them? Charles had turned Burgundy into one long funeral procession. But before anyone could act, Charles managed to get himself killed in battle, face down in the snow, wearing gold armor. No assassin needed. Sometimes ego does the job just fine. Let's glide over to Italy again, because of course we're going there. The 15th century in Italy was like a soap opera with daggers. You had noble families pretending to be civilized while secretly poisoning each other between banquets. The Medici family, Florence's glittering dynasty of bankers and benevolent dictators, were particularly fond of this game. Cosimo de' Medici ruled through charm, bribery, and a suspicious number of accidents that happened to his rivals. But it was his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who nearly got a dagger to the throat in one of the infamous assassination attempts of the Renaissance, the Pazzi Conspiracy. So, it's Easter Sunday, 1478, the Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano, are attending Mass in Florence Cathedral. Everyone's dressed in their finest, pretending to be holy. And then, in the middle of the service, chaos. The Pazzi family and their allies draw daggers and attack. Giuliano is stabbed to death. Lorenzo fights his way out, bleeding but alive. The conspirators thought they'd killed Florence's rulers and could just stroll into power. They miscalculated. The people turned on them instantly. Within hours, Florence became a medieval horror show of revenge. Assassins were dragged through the streets, hanged from windows, and torn apart by angry mobs. The message was clear. If you come for the Medicis, you'd better finish the job. And thus, Florence learned the fine art of stab softly and carry a big crossbow. Meanwhile, up in England, assassination had a different flavor: colder, quieter, and usually served with political paperwork. Meet Richard III, the man Shakespeare called a hunchbacked villain who killed his nephews. Now, the physical deformity part was, well, heavily exaggerated. But the murder part? Yeah, that one's murky. After seizing the throne in 1483, Richard placed his young nephews, the princes in the Tower, in the royal fortress for safekeeping. They were never seen again.
Did Richard order their deaths? Maybe. Did someone else do it to make him look guilty? Also maybe. History doesn't tell us for sure, but let's be honest, medieval politics weren't exactly full of subtlety. If two heirs vanished in your castle, people tended to assume you were involved. And for centuries, the mystery of those missing princes haunted England, not because it was unusual, but because it was so normal. Power changed hands through blood. It was just a matter of whose.
Now, let's drift east to Russia, where subtlety was never really part of the job description. Enter Ivan the Terrible. The name says it all, really. Ivan ruled in the 16th century, and his reign was a delightful mix of paranoia, random executions, and emotional breakdowns. He created a secret police force called the Oprichniki, who rode black horses, wore black robes, and went around cleansing the land of traitors. Translation: they terrorized everyone. Ivan was convinced everyone was plotting against him: the nobles, the clergy, the servants, possibly even his own shadow. So, like any reasonable monarch, he started eliminating anyone he even thought was disloyal. His favorite methods included stabbing, drowning, and the occasional creative execution. You know, just normal Tuesday things. Eventually, his paranoia spiraled so far out of control that he killed his own son in a fit of rage. And after that, well, Russia got exactly what you'd expect from decades of terror. Power secured through blood never really lasts. But not every assassin in history worked for kings. Some were kings. Take Queen Isabella of Castile. Yes, the same one who funded Christopher Columbus. But before she was uniting Spain or launching questionable voyages, she was knee-deep in court conspiracies. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon wasn't a fairy tale. It was a chess move. Together, they built a monarchy out of alliances, arranged marriages, and a few disappearances that history politely calls political necessity. Isabella's reign saw the rise of the Spanish Inquisition, which was less religious reform and more state-sponsored paranoia. It was basically a bureaucratic form of assassination. You didn't need daggers when you could just declare someone a heretic and confiscate their property. Faster, cleaner, and publicly approved. So while other monarchs used blades, Isabella used paperwork and priests, and honestly, it worked frighteningly well. But let's pause for a moment and breathe. Because under all this royal scheming and bloodshed, there's a strange kind of pattern. The higher you climbed, the more dangerous it became. The peasants killed for coins. The nobles killed for land. The kings killed for legacy. Everyone, at every level, was fighting for survival. Just different stakes. And if you ever wonder how the Middle Ages managed to last as long as it did, it wasn't because of divine order or strong leadership. It was because, somehow, in all the chaos, everyone believed they were doing what they had to do to stay alive. So, as the candles burn lower and the halls grow quieter, imagine it. The echo of footsteps in a stone corridor, the flicker of torchlight, and the tension of knowing that even the king might not see sunrise.
Hey there, still with me? If you are, that's impressive, because we're about to sink into the quieter, darker part of this story. The kind where the noise of kings and wars fades away, and all that's left is the shuffle of boots on cobblestones and the soft whisper of a knife being drawn. Tonight, we're talking about the forgotten artisans of death, the ones who didn't wear crowns or command armies. They didn't have banners or crests or even names you'd find in a history book. They had jobs, short-term ones, very short-term, usually. Let's call them the craftsmen, because really, that's what they were. Meticulous, methodical, and sometimes disturbingly practical. Most of these men, and occasionally women, weren't trained in any formal sense. There was no university of subtle poisoning or stabbing for beginners. They learned by doing. And by doing, I mean surviving their first mistake. If you were caught trying to kill a noble, you didn't get a second chance, or a trial for that matter. You got creative punishments, hanging, flaying, or, if the executioner was feeling artistic, something with fire. So, naturally, assassins adapted. They got smarter, quieter. You could say the best assassins were like ghosts, not because they were supernatural, but because nobody really believed they existed until it was too late. Let's drift to medieval Italy again, because Italy, for centuries, was basically an assassination convention with nice architecture. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Milan thrived on politics, money, and grudges. The line between merchant and murderer was thin enough to trip over. There were whispers of professional poisoners, chemists, apothecaries, and sometimes even physicians who offered discreet remedies for certain problems. They mixed powders, tinctures, and liquids that killed slowly enough to look natural. A bit of arsenic here, a touch of mercury there, and voila, you had a nobleman with mysterious stomach troubles. The best part, poison was democratic. You didn't need a sword arm or noble blood to use it, just patience and access to the kitchen. Speaking of Italy's greatest export, poison, we can't avoid the Borgias. Ah, yes, the family that put the fun in functional dysfunction. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was a walking contradiction, head of the Catholic Church and part-time crime boss. His children, Cesare and Lucrezia, carried on the family tradition of political ambition and creative problem-solving. Now, were the Borgias actually the serial poisoners everyone accused them of being? Probably not as much as history claims. But did people around them tend to die at convenient times? Absolutely. Cesare Borgia was the charming but terrifying kind of man who'd have been perfect for a medieval HR department, if the job involved managing conspiracies and terminating rivals. And Lucrezia, well, she was either a cunning manipulator or just really unlucky in marriage, hard to say. Every time she tied the knot, her husband died shortly after. Sometimes from illness, sometimes from accidents, and sometimes from, you guessed it, dinner. But here's the thing. Back then, poison wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a statement. It said, I can kill you, and no one will ever prove it. That's a kind of power swords could never give. Outside Italy, the assassin trade looked a little different. In Germany during the 14th and 15th centuries, you had Fehdebriefs, literal letters of feud. If someone declared a blood feud against you, they'd send an official letter saying, hey, I'm legally allowed to attack you now. And people wonder why medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for stability. But not everyone had the patience for paperwork. Some nobles hired free knights, mercenaries who'd sneak into castles, ambush carriages, or burn farms to make a point. They weren't subtle, but they were efficient. And honestly, that's how a lot of assassination worked back then. Blunt, messy, and with plausible deniability. If your enemy fell down the stairs, was it murder? Maybe. Or maybe the stairs were just feeling patriotic that day.
But if we're talking about organized killing, we have to travel a bit east, to the Middle East around the 11th century. This is where the word assassin actually comes from. The Nizari Ismailis, a secretive sect led by Hassan-e Sabah. From their mountain fortress at Alamut, They waged psychological warfare against their enemies, mostly through targeted killings. They were trained, disciplined, and deeply loyal. They didn't use poison or bows, they used daggers, always up close, always personal. They believed dying in the mission was an honor, which made them terrifyingly effective. European crusaders came into contact with them and didn't really understand what was going on, so they did what Europeans do best – mispronounced things. They heard Hashishin, a term possibly related to hashish or followers of Hassan, and turned it into assassin. And just like that, the legend was born. Of course, over time, their name got twisted into something romantic and mysterious, but in reality, they were closer to medieval hitmen with a very strong work ethic. Back in Europe, meanwhile, assassination was evolving into an art of timing. Take France in the late 16th century, the era of religious wars, royal feuds, and everyone pretending to be holier than they actually were. King Henry III of France had a bit of a problem. Specifically, the Duke of Guise, powerful, popular, and not so subtly plotting to overthrow him. So Henry invited him to a meeting. You can guess how that went. As soon as the Duke entered the royal chamber, guards stabbed him to death. The king reportedly said, "Now I am king," which feels like the kind of thing you'd say if you were trying to convince yourself it was true. Of course, karma didn't take long. A few months later, a fanatical monk stabbed Henry III in return. Medieval France, where diplomacy was just murder with extra paperwork. By now you might be noticing a pattern. Assassination wasn't really about hatred, it was about maintenance. Keeping power balanced, cleaning up problems, making sure the wrong person didn't sit on the right chair. The act itself was rarely personal. The assassin was just a tool, like a dagger or a goblet of wine. And for every ruler who died by the blade, there were 10 more who slept with one eye open, wondering if tonight was the night. Imagine that. Every banquet, every prayer, every night's sleep shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. It's not exactly a relaxing lifestyle. But there were a few who managed to turn the craft into something almost philosophical. One of them was François Ravaillac, a religious zealot who assassinated King Henry IV of France in 1010. He claimed divine inspiration, said an angel told him to do it. He waited patiently, for days, until the king's carriage was stopped in traffic. Then he simply stepped forward and stabbed him through the window. No cloak, no dagger, no conspiracy. Just faith and madness. He was, of course, executed in the most medieval way imaginable, drawn and quartered, but even in his death, Ravaillac changed something. His act reminded Europe that no king, however powerful, was untouchable. That realization echoed for centuries. Let's dim the torches for a moment and drift back to the lower streets, where the real ghosts lived. The nameless ones. The men who killed lords for a single coin. The women who slipped powders into goblets for a promise of bread. They didn't write history, and history didn't write them. But if you listen closely, in the quiet between centuries, you can almost hear them breathing. Their legacy isn't in monuments or books. It's in the uneasy silence that still lingers around power. Because every palace, every throne, every crown was built on the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always willing to take it away.
Hey there! Welcome back! If you've made it this far, congratulations! You've officially outlasted several medieval monarchs who couldn't even survive their own dinner. So let's get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a bit more. Because tonight, we're stepping quietly into the candlelit world of royal paranoia, a place where every cup of wine could be your last, and where trust was, well, a luxury item. You see, after centuries of daggers, poisons, and "oops, I slipped" moments on palace staircases, monarchs got the memo. Everyone might be trying to kill you. And thus began a fascinating, slightly ridiculous era of over-the-top safety measures. Let's call it Security Theater Medieval Edition. First stop, ancient Persia, where the kings of the Achaemenid Empire lived like gods, mostly because everyone around them was too afraid to breathe without permission. Their meals were prepared under heavy supervision, tasted 3 times, and sealed in golden dishes. Food tasters were required to eat from the royal plate before the king took a bite. Sounds like a cushy job, until you realize that statistically, it was also a short-term job. Imagine being paid in gold, but living in constant suspense, like playing culinary Russian roulette every evening. One wrong grape, and congratulations, you've become part of palace floor decor. Centuries later, the tradition carried on into medieval Europe, where the paranoia had evolved into an art form. Every king worth his scepter had a taster, or 2, or if he was particularly neurotic, an entire small army of people whose only job was to eat. Henry VIII, for example, the man famous for collecting wives the way some people collect bad habits, had a full entourage of food tasters, cupbearers, and even a yeoman of the mouth. Yes, that was a real title. And yes, it sounds just as uncomfortable as the job probably was. The yeoman's main duty was to make sure no one poisoned the royal dinner, which was a full-time gig considering Henry's enemies included the Pope, half of France, and occasionally his own wives. Ironically, Henry didn't die of poison. He died of being Henry, obese, infected, and surrounded by his own regrets. But the paranoia remained royal tradition. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France took things a step further. At the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who believed the universe revolved around his radiant self, every move was dictated by ritual. Even something as mundane as washing his hands required an audience and at least 3 titles of nobility. But beneath all that glittering ceremony was fear. Poison had become a fashionable weapon in 17th century France. The affair of the poisons, a massive scandal, revealed that half the aristocracy was buying arsenic from street witches and fortune tellers. Everyone from bored housewives to dukes dabbled in murder by makeup. And Louis, understandably, lost whatever remained of his trust in humanity. Food tasters, guards, priests, astrologers, everyone had a role in making sure His Majesty didn't keel over at breakfast. It's said he even avoided walking in certain gardens because the air might be tampered with, which, if nothing else, proves that anxiety isn't a modern invention. Let's float north to Russia, because if paranoia had a capital city, it might have been Moscow under Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan trusted almost no one, which in fairness was justified. He'd been betrayed, manipulated, and abandoned since childhood. So by the time he grew up, he built a little club called the Oprichnina, part secret police, part personal death squad. They dressed in black, carried dog heads on their saddles, and were tasked with sniffing out betrayal, literally and figuratively. Ivan even created a separate city within Moscow just for himself and his loyal guards, where he could eat, pray, and sleep without worrying about conspirators, at least not too many of them. And yet, even surrounded by walls and fanatics, he never relaxed. One day, in a fit of rage, he killed his own son with a staff, then spent the rest of his life regretting it. By the end, Ivan had become the very thing he feared: unpredictable, unstable, and utterly alone.
Back in Western Europe, royal safety was getting downright scientific. Take Elizabeth I of England. She was the kind of queen who could turn paranoia into policy. Every letter she received was steamed open by spies to check for hidden powders or poisons. Every visitor was scrutinized. Every servant's loyalty was tested.
sometimes literally through torture. She surrounded herself with one of the most effective intelligence networks in history, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, basically the 16th century version of MI6. And yet, despite all her precautions, Elizabeth lived her entire reign knowing that half of Europe wanted her dead. Catholic plots, Spanish spies, and one extremely persistent cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, all kept her nerves on edge. In fact, Elizabeth eventually signed Mary's death warrant just to sleep easier. Though easier is a relative term when you're eating off gold plates in constant fear. You might think all this royal anxiety would fade over time. But nope. If anything, it evolved into something even stranger. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European monarchs became symbolically paranoid. They weren't necessarily afraid of being stabbed. They were afraid of being replaced. Napoleon, for instance, was obsessed with loyalty. He had spies everywhere, a personal guard made up of veterans, and a famously detailed schedule so nobody could catch him off guard. Yet, despite all that control, he still managed to get betrayed, exiled, and humiliated. Twice. There's something almost poetic about it. The man who crowned himself emperor couldn't escape the quiet conspiracies of his own court. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburgs, those champions of inbreeding and strategic marriage, took a different approach. Their paranoia wasn't violent, it was bureaucratic. Every movement, every letter, every conversation within the royal family was logged, filed, and copied. The empire ran on gossip reports and coded notes, and honestly, it's amazing anything got done. But this culture of control couldn't stop tragedy. Take Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She hated court life, hated the rules, and spent most of her time traveling incognito just to feel human. In 1898, during one of her anonymous walks in Geneva, a man approached her on the street and stabbed her with a sharpened file. She didn't even realize what had happened until minutes later. It's darkly ironic. After centuries of overprotection, the Habsburgs lost their empress to a random act of street violence. Sometimes, the danger didn't come from conspiracies or poisons. Sometimes, it just found you anyway. But paranoia wasn't just for kings and queens. It trickled down to the noble classes too. Servants were watched, guests were vetted, wine was locked away like state secrets. In some courts, even the royal pets had official tasters. Yes, dog food tasters existed, because apparently no one trusted anything with a pulse. The irony is that this level of suspicion often created the very betrayals they feared. After all, if you treat everyone like a potential assassin, eventually someone decides to prove you're right. By the dawn of the 20th century, the age of royal assassinations had changed form. No more poisoned chalices or daggered courtiers. Now it was revolvers and ideology. Tsar Nicholas II, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, King Alexander of Serbia, all fell not to personal vendettas, but to the new assassins of modernity, the radicals, the anarchists, the dreamers with bombs in their coats. And in a sense, the story came full circle, because whether it was a dagger in a medieval alley or a pistol in Sarajevo, the meaning remained the same. Power always paints a target on itself, and history, ever patient, ever silent, always finds someone willing to take the shot. So tonight, as we close our eyes on centuries of whispered plots, think about this. The kings, the queens, the poisoners, the guards, they all lived in a world where trust was a myth. And for all their crowns and castles, they slept just as lately as the peasants outside their gates. Maybe that's the real curse of power. Not dying by the dagger,
but living in fear of it.